Right. I hope you all are doing well. I'm going to talk in this video about the synthesis portion of essay number one. If you are watching this video and you haven't watched the previous two, which is probably unlikely, but just in case, you really do need to go back and watch the video in response to Holly Fretwell and then the video that lays out essay number one. I realize that these are not the most kind of riveting things. My production values aren't super high. They're really the most efficient way for me to get a lot of information to you. I'm happy to answer questions about anything that's produced here, but um, in general, I find that even if the video, kind of the talking head video, isn't ideal, it works better than just trying to give you 4 pages of text or something like that. And again, I do try to keep these short, 10 to 15 minutes. Um, the the syllabus video has 25 views, which is great. The view numbers have gone down dramatically since that time. So again, if you haven't looked at those, there is important information that isn't anywhere else in them. So please do make sure that you keep track of those. You can find them all on the class YouTube channel. You can find them linked in the relevant assignments. So I'm going to talk about the synthesis part of essay number one. You know by now that you have to write 2 summaries, and there's a lot of information about summary and how to do summary effectively in the previous video. I have here on the screen a summary of Holly Fretwell's essay, The NPS Franchise, A Better Way to Protect Our Heritage. And let me myself a little smaller so you can see it. This is an example of a very effective summary. I'm not going to read the entire thing aloud, but I would just point out if you kind of scan through it, and I'll post this as a handout in Canvas, that it talks about Fretwell's kind of key ideas. It points to important details. It includes uh, quotes that are relevant to helping us understand what her argument is, um, and um, it discusses her idea in really specific terms. So we're going to turn in a minute to talk about Marty Blatt's essay, and then we're going to talk about what we would do if you were writing about Fretwell and Blatt, which you're not, but if you had a summary of Fretwell and a summary of Blatt, the next part of the assignment says, okay, write a 1-paragraph synthesis of the two. What does that mean? That's where we're going to get to in a few minutes. Before we do that, though, I just want to note that the synthesis part, it doesn't really make sense, and you can't really do it until you have effective and detailed summaries of each article. We're going to look at in a second just a little quick 1-paragraph summary of Marty Blatt. If I was actually working on this and that's all I had, I wouldn't go to the synthesis yet. I would try to flesh this out and make it a little bit more detailed. Even if it wasn't necessarily a full page like this, a couple really good paragraphs, so I could ensure that I had a clear and detailed understanding of Blatt's ideas. We are, however, going to use this short summary just as just for the sake of it. And again, if you haven't read Marty Blatt's essay, make sure you can just pause this right now. Go ahead and do that. It's on the shorter and more straightforward side. So we know that Holly Fretwell's essay proposes adopting a franchise model in order to create new parks. Highlighting here. These new parks would also allow passionate members of the public who wish to see change to get involved. She lists a few examples of private groups that are currently involved with running natural and cultural sites. These examples show the passion franchisees would have. She argues that this grassroots creation of national parks gets enthusiastic people involved and does not impose on the already stretched budget of the NPS. Okay. Marty Blatt's essay, From Civil War to Civil Rights. Again, this is a very short summary of it. You should have read it and have an understanding of what it says, but just for the sake of kind of keeping things moving. Blatt argues that the NPS glosses over the Reconstruction era and does not provide proper education about it. They ignore Reconstruction in parks on the website in their videos. There is no NPS site devoted to Reconstruction. He notes that the Reconstruction era was a disaster for African Americans and to equality and racial integration from a national perspective. He notes that when the NPS jumps from the end of slavery to the civil rights movement, it leaves a huge gap. There are sites in the MPS devoted to the Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks, MLK Jr., Malcolm X, March on Selma, etc., and many Civil War battlefields. He notes that the MPS focuses on what could be seen as a success narrative of American history. He proposes a new site on the Sea Islands in South Carolina devoted to the history of Reconstruction. Excuse me. So again, there's more in that essay, but just to give us kind of a working knowledge of what it says, that's where we're going to start. So the synthesis, let's say you've got this summary, you feel pretty good about it. You flesh out this summary until it's about a page long and you feel pretty good about it. What is the synthesis? The synthesis portion of the assignment asks you to put the two essays in conversation with each other. And notably, I think in big bold letters on the assignment sheet, it says, this is not a compare and contrast. In other words, we don't want to just list the similarities and differences between these two essays. Mostly because the essays are so different that that would just be kind of boring and almost nonsensical, right? Both Marty Blatt and Holly Fretwell are similar because they talk about the National Park Service, but they're different because Marty Blatt talks about Reconstruction and Holly Fretwell talks about franchises. There's not really much you can do with that. The synthesis assignment instead asks you to imagine how you could put these essays in conversation. If Marty Blatt was speaking to Holly Fretwell, what would they have to say to each other? How would their ideas kind of intersect and relate, even if it seems really counterintuitive? How might they speak to each other? So I have a handout that I'll put in this assignment and in this module that gives you some questions that might start you thinking along these lines. I want to note that the purpose of this handout is not, okay, answer every one of these questions and then like delete the questions and then that's your synthesis. Instead, maybe take one or two of these that feel like they're relevant and use them to get you started thinking. And as you can see, they force you to think a little bit more imaginatively and a little bit more in a more sophisticated fashion to really think about how these things that in many cases, your essays may appear to be about totally different things. How might they speak to each other? If they are on similar topics, how do the author's ideas about those topics kind of, speak to each other? Where would they find consensus? Where might they challenge each other? That's what we mean when we're putting things in conversation. So we're going to choose one of these. Again, this handout is going to be in the module. It'll be called Synthesis Brainstorming. We're going to choose one of these and just think about how it would get us started, again, if we were writing about Fretwell and Blatt. So let's use this one. And let's say that author A is going to be Marty Blatt. Marty Blatt could use Holly Fretwell's ideas about franchising in order to accomplish his goal of creating a new national park devoted to Reconstruction. Okay, easy to kind of fill in those blanks. What does that mean? Let's expand on it for a few sentences. By using the franchise model, Blatt wouldn't have to rely on new funding from the federal government. Instead, he could find donors or organizations that would be interested in funding a more complete examination of the Reconstruction era. And there's some points in Blatt's essay where he talks about kind of some of the bureaucracy of the MPS and some of those things. Fretwell talks about that too. So maybe that's a benefit of this, right? The franchise system could help Blatt avoid some of the bureaucracy and resistance within the NPS. Okay, interesting. I want to take it a little bit further though, and think about, okay, this makes it seem like Fretwell and Blatt would be like actually, even though they're speaking about different things, they would be like totally in agreement. Is it that simple? I kind of wonder. It seems like the franchise model would be a good deal for Blatt. However, I wonder what flaws he might find. Well, one of Blatt's main complaints is that um, the National Park Service is just kind of skipping something that's really important, that really, really matters, and that there's this huge flaw in the way that the National Park Service sees history. I wonder if Blatt would therefore be kind of like almost offended by this idea that, like, okay, well, you can have a park, but the federal government's not going to pay for it, right? He might almost say, okay, well, I got the park. That's cool, I guess, and it's technically a national park, but it also just kind of reflects the NPS and by extension the federal government's kind of refusal to commit resources to this. And so, yeah, we have the park. That's nice, but really it's kind of a hollow victory, right? Because it hasn't sort of changed anything fundamentally. So again, if I was kind of thinking about how I would write this in a synthesis, Blatt might be hesitant to employ the franchise model um, because it would not force the NPS to confront this gap in history or to devote funds to it. And you could imagine a few more sentences going on and kind of exploring that idea. So ultimately what we're going to build is a really clear and detailed paragraph. We don't have to go back and count the sentences, but we're going to add a few more sentences to that really put these articles in an interesting conversation and really think carefully about, again, these two things seem like they're kind of on totally different wavelengths. How could we sort of bring them together, put them in the same room and get them talking? What would be the points of agreement, disagreement? Where would some ideas like be adaptable to other situations? Where would they maybe not be adaptable? Where would like in the one example, what about a third party, right? So the superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park reads Blatt and Fretwell. Is there anything they could do to address reconstruction at RMNP? Might they think about how the franchise model could help them in terms of like maybe adding space to the park or something like that, right? That might not be the best example, and not all of these questions will work for everyone. That's why I suggest really looking through them and thinking about how they might fit with your particular article or pair of articles. So I'm going to wrap this up here. Please let me know what questions you have. I'm going to email you all to make sure that you're watching videos. And then we'll go from there.